Okay, are we all ready? Good to go. All right. So we shall start our webinar on the dot. So we are actually 3 minutes after 5:30. So a very good afternoon to all those who are joining us today. Webinar is organized by the International Federation of Journalists, IFJ Asia Pacific. And a shout out to the team behind the hard work organizing this webinar. This is the second one. First one we had a couple of months ago. It was about the report published by IFJ. So hello, I'm Norman Goh, journalist and producer of weekly podcast Bicara Minggu Ini, covering current affairs, politics, and socio-economic stories. So today we'll be learning about the current media landscape in the country, understanding the existing legal framework for the media and procedures for both avoiding charges and dealing with the ramifications. You know, sometimes where journalists do get called in by the authorities, or sometimes in the stories that you do, you get letter of demand by politicians and even those in power. So what can you do? What can we do as journalists? What newsrooms can do to provide the support for the journalists? So to start our conversation today, I'd like to invite Kishan Tariq. He is the committee member of the National Union of Journalists of Malaysia, and he's also the IOJ's Institute of Journalism Malaysia's president. To begin with the welcoming, over to you, Kishan.
Thanks, Norman. Hi. Good afternoon, guys. As you know, editorials aside, journalism is in part about disseminating truth to the public. But unfortunately, the truth is often hard to hear and sometimes even embarrassing for some. Nothing like having someone repeat what you say to realize how stupid you sound. And anyone who's covered politics or retweeted people on Twitter would know what I'm talking about. Well, nowadays it's more in vogue to just like say something's fake news, but old school people in Malaysia especially would rather take their beef to court. And this has ranged from like libel suits, police investigations, and various laws that have been curbing media freedom. And personally, I've been a court reporter for about 4 or 5 years previously. And I've seen a lot of colleagues and other people put through the ringer for various perceived insults or unflattering news. Anyway, I think the fact that a libel suit is called saman malu in Malaysia says a lot about the mentality of people who bring these things to court. For every legitimate case, there are many others with like, small dick energy. So our speakers today have definitely seen a lot more of this such mollifying behavior in court, and I'm sure are much more qualified to discuss this issue at length. So as such, I'll pass the mic back to Norman and leave it to him to introduce them.
Thank you so much, Kishan. And when Kishan was talking about malufying, means sometimes they want to put journalists to shame and then trying to intimidate journalists not to write stories about them. It's kind of things that we do face. I mean, everywhere around the world. I think Malaysia is no different sometimes. So I'd like to begin to introduce to our speakers today. First, we have Jerald Joseph. He is currently Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia, SUHAKAM. For the last 20 years, he has been a human rights defender and trainer consultant at both local and international levels. So Jerald served as a member of various human rights organizations, including Commonwealth Foundation, Asian South Pacific Bureau for Adult Education, Asia Pacific NGO Steering Committee of World Conference Against Racism. He is also a board member and advisor of the Anti-Racism and Non-Discrimination Program of Pusat Komunikasi Masyarakat, Pusat KOMAS. Next one, we have New Sin Yu. He is one of our, usual faces. Every time when journalists do face some problems, we'll go to him. He's one of our favorite counsels. So Sin Yu has been a solicitor and counsel in Malaysia. He read law at Cardiff University and was called to the English Bar, Lincoln's Inn, in 2010, and admitted as an advocate and solicitor at the High Court of Malaya in 2011. So currently, his portfolio includes advising public and private corporations on legal and regulatory compliance in the areas of company and securities law, representing a state government in 3 major disputes before the courts of land, water, and construction of a university, advising a firm in consulting engineers in an ongoing royal commission on inquiry into tragic collapse of high-rise structure. So his clients have ranged from members of parliament in election petition hearings to refugees resisting deportation and seeking asylum, and journalists charged under Malaysia's media laws. Long list of them. I think today we're going to discuss about that too. So in 2020, Sinu has also acted as the IFJ's observer in the Malaysia Kini and Stephen Gans trial. So welcome to the webinar, Sinu and Jerald. So we start off in the first part of our webinar. So let's look at an overview of how of our press and the rights of our media practitioners in Malaysia. What is the current state today? So over to you, Jerald. You've been a commissioner in 3 different administrations. First, you have a 6-decade-long Barisan Nasional, then to Pakatan Harapan in 2018, and now in Perikatan Nasional. 3 different administration during your time as a commissioner. So how has it been for the press in Malaysia over the past decades?
Thank you, Norman and IFJ for the invitation. Kishin, thank you for the invitation. Hi, Sinu. Okay, yeah, this is a comparative study. I think this one is worth 3 PhDs because it's hard to actually say anything. But the good news is this country is not what it was before at both ends. Meaning we had what I would call the darker period of human rights, and press suffered a lot. I'm sure Kishin's colleagues, his more senior colleagues at that time, were really under the thumb, and media was controlled quite directly, and we all used to laugh and say, you have to get permission and phone calls and all that. So I think the press was never a standard bearer for information and the truth. Bits and pieces would come out, but most of it was a quite guided type of media. So that's where we started off. We meaning, when I was in school, universities, that's the kind of press. So there is a marked difference from the Barisan Nasional media to Pakatan Harapan. Also because at the end of the Barisan Nasional, media was not solely print, television, radio. It became more democratized media. All of us were happily sharing all kinds of information. So media had to catch up with free flow of information. I think that was the good news about technology. It democratized our freedom to share. That gave a push to the media owners to rethink. But the substance of what they report was still heavily guarded and locked and guided by central government. Then comes Pakatan Harapan with a promise of amazing manifesto for freedom of media. It stated as clearly as possible the setting of the council. So that was the hope of truly what we had hoped, a new chapter. But I think immediately the media was freed of its own shackles. Media started reporting differently. I think that fresh breath of air was what has now brought about a big shift in the journalist world. I think not for lack of journalists being journalists, but it's just that shadow controlling the editors and the top, I think, was a bit more lifted. So it went away, And so for the first time, you could get good stuff in print media, national mainstream print media, or television, as well as critical stuff in these 2 areas. Before, we only had to rely on online type media like Malaysia Kini and the likes to give us a different part of the story. And now we are in Perikatan Nasional. So for now, I think it's not any big shift. It's just that reporting what government practice has changed. So, but I think the phone calls maybe have started a little bit more careful. Reporting has happened. But I think now we are just getting fed up with what we read. It's because not fed up with the media, but we are fed up with the present reality. So I think, yeah, it's 3 different shades of human rights and press freedom in Malaysia. I hope the shade should get better, lighter, brighter, but not so clear at this moment. Thank you, Norman.
Thanks, Gerald. Looking at the different, I think it is we're still living in the shades of grey in Malaysia for our press here. Not referring to any books of any kind, shades of grey, but then we were referring to how things are. What we are facing, yes, although that we have seen much greater access and space open up for the press. For Sinu, after the 2018 elections, there have been a lot of complaints about the reforms and media democratization. It was perceived as very slow over the past 2 years in the new government. Well, they have promised and even written in their manifesto. How do you look at it?
Well, it's quite regrettable, isn't it? I mean, we for the first time in our history, we had a government that was willing to put their writing, what they promise on paper, that they are going to abolish certain restrictive laws on media freedom. And I think a lot of us were very frustrated when that didn't happen, even though they had this window of opportunity of, was it 22 months? I think it's about there, 22 months to overturn certain laws. And that didn't happen. And now we have a situation where there is nothing that we can hold the government onto anymore. And it's just quite frustrating, because like what Jerald said, the harassment of the media is something that is constant, even back in the BN days, and it continued, albeit it was a bit better during the PH times. But let's not forget that it was still ongoing. The Sedition Act was not used during the PH time, but there were other laws that were being used. The most infamous one is Section 233 of the Communications and Multimedia Act. And then you have criminal defamation under the Penal Code, Section 499 and 500. And you have Section 503, actions to invoke breach of peace. So, it's something that is still happening, and the laws are still here, which enables the government to do that. I think what we need now is to set aside what is partisan and to go back to first principles as to why we need a free and independent media. I think somewhere along the line, that conversation has been lost. It's always an argument about harassment, what was being reported, the topic itself, but we are not having enough discussion as to why we are even talking about media freedom in the first place. That part of the discourse seems to be largely absent, even amongst media practitioners. And I think in the current political situation of our country, where you don't know whether the government is going to fall the following day, it's important that we set out what are our demands and be united about it. Because I think regardless of what government that we may have, it's quite important for us to have this fourth estate that continues to check on it, because it's not just beneficial for the both sides, it's beneficial for everyone in general. So that's just some of my thoughts.
Sinu, I'll also top up just to follow up on what you mentioned earlier, some of the laws. And some of these laws in the Penal Code, you mentioned about 503 or even 505. I remember even the usual ones has also been used against members of parliament, which includes 124, Penal Code 124. The Act of Against Parliamentary Democracy. It can also be used against journalists. So, do you think we where are we heading to actually in this kind of situation? How would journalists, to a point that, do you think that journalists and also newsrooms are doing more of self-censorship, and even to avoid critically reporting when it comes to what we call as the three R's: race, religion,
Yeah.
and the royals?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even amongst lawyers, we tend to self-censor, even though we enjoy a certain degree of privilege of what we get to say in court. But if it's happening to lawyers, I could imagine it would happen to journalists as well. And I think there is definitely a chilling effect that has been caused by the use of all these laws, which when it was enacted, it was never meant to censor free speech or censor reporting. The whole portion or the whole part on section 124 onwards, which deals with offences against the state, waging war against the Yang di-Pertuan Agong, those were amendments that were meant to deal with terrorism. And, it was never meant to deal with the media. It was never meant to curb free speech. But the inevitable effect is that because how these laws were drafted, how the wordings are so vague, it's being used liberally, and it's being misused or used liberally by the government to not just silent journalists, but silent MPs as well, and silent any dissenters. So of course, if you think about it, yes, that's definitely that chilling effect, because you don't want to go through the trouble of dealing with the harassment and dealing with the limitations against one's liberty that comes along with the investigation. Because when you are being investigated, and if they decide to use a particular law which is meant to deal with terrorism, or what's going to happen is that you could be arrested for up to 28 days, and no one wants to lose 28 days, not even one day of their life. And the easier way, of course, is to self-censor and to avoid falling into that situation. So even if ultimately that law is not used to charge you, you don't have to face a criminal offense at the end of the day. But the investigation process itself is enough of a torment for you to think twice about what you are about to say.
Thanks, Inu. I think I've also had experiences for some of the editors and also journalists being called in for investigation. They had to sit in through long hours of giving statements, even up to about 8 hours or even 9 hours, even the whole day. This sort of some of the ways that sometimes people in power may actually use them to, although they're just doing their job in carrying out investigations and in getting the your statement, but this sort of way, it's very intimidating. It sends, like what you said, mentioned earlier, chilling effect to everyone, to whether you want to go through that sort of experience and being locked up in a room with no one, and you don't know whether it's day or night. It's the kind of thing that may happen. So move on to the second part from here, is that looking at the current legal framework governing the press in Malaysia. So Jerald, so despite the repeal of the Anti-Fake News Act last year, the challenges faced by the press in the legal framework remain pretty much the same. What Sinu has also mentioned earlier. He listed quite a number of views of restrictive laws, such as the Official Secrets Act, the PPPA, Press Printing and Publications Act, Communications and Multimedia Act, particularly the Section 233 A that was mentioning about, it was so vague, where to a point that anyone, if they deem that you are abusing the network, or you just say something where it outrages a modesty of a person, you get investigated. Very simple things like that. So this have been used against critical press and journalists. to the extent of using Prevention of Terrorism Act, POTA, and National Security Act as an arbitrary detention and warrantless arrest under state emergency. Today, we've just seen the announcement of state emergency in 2 constituencies just to cancel the by-election. So that's one. What do you say about that, Jerald? I mean, earlier, beginning of the year, I remember SUHAKAM published a statement about this is the year of journalism reporting without fear or favor. Over to you, Jerald.
Thanks. Well, when you're going through that long list, it's bringing back history of the arrests from ISA for journalists and all kinds of law. Actually, strangely enough, there's lack of protection for carriers of information. No? So the media plays a role, as I said, the fourth estate and that's important for a functioning democracy to work. So I just want to share this one slide that. How do I do this?
You can go to share screen.
No, I got it now. It's just okay. Okay, did I share? Or did I share? Yeah, okay. So just this one slide to say that I think the framework of how we are talking about is that journalists and media workers have to be put in the same category as human rights defenders, because caring of that information is a right. I want that information. I want to know, and I cannot be allowed not to know. And where else do I get if not journalists who do the dirty work of carrying that information? So, so by just telling a story, it can be the most innocent sounding story of just reporting this happened, but then suddenly it explodes and something else comes out. And we should be able to defend this journalist. And journalists may not start off, sometimes the word human rights is not used in journalism. Oh, you have, I'm local government reporting, I am, entertainment industry. You have so many sections, but information may sound like it's not loaded, but the very fact that the information is out there, it opens up other possibilities and it grows and suddenly it becomes a human rights story, So I think we need to defend this space. And I think that cartoon that I picked up of Zuna, I mean, Zuna is a cartoonist, he's got it. Many journalists, I think you mentioned it earlier, Norman. They've been arrested, hounded, investigated, and just charging may be very low, but just to be called in for that investigation, I think already sends the signal, and that should never happen. The problem with us is that information that is not agreed upon by people in power is not counted with other information. And I think that's why we don't have that mature space where you fight each other using information and things will come out. The laws are more than chilly. It freezes people. We still have old archaic law like sedition law that is still looming over our heads. We have, I think the list of laws that was mentioned by Sinu is already there, but even other laws that are supposedly used for other functions like the Prevention of POTA, Terrorism Act, it can easily be used on any journalist because say, oh, your writing is opening up space and a danger to society. There's enough of this vague languages that gives police a lot of power. The Official Secrets Act makes the work of journalists almost like you are a guessing journalist rather than ability to find the truth, So we are not making it correct for journalists to play their role. And then when the news does not come out correctly, people get angry that you're only reporting half the truth. But, we don't have a protection of that right to information, which I think maybe later we should have a bit of discussion about. And strangely, we are still borrowing a lot of the old British law of Printing Publication Act, where you need permission, permits, and also now the online media. I think Malaysia Kini's case is telling. Suddenly, they have to also take care of the free flow of comments of people making reaction to something. This is again, this is just to to get the message out. You cannot allow too much of this critical news. But this speaks to us not only defending journalists, but defending that space called freedom of expression. I think a government coming into being, and that's why I said to Perikatan Nasional, this new government, you must have fought with all kinds of maneuvering political strategy to get into government. There must be a reason. I mean, if you want to be government, then you have a responsibility to defend these spaces constitutionally. The shortcut, the easiest way is to say, no, you cannot do this, you cannot. But that's no big deal. Most despots, most military governments and dictatorships do that. But we are not, and we should not be that. So to any aspiring government who wants to unseat PN or work, you better decide what is it you want to be a government for. Because I think you probably can make more money outside as businessmen than being government. So then why you become a government unless there is some other ulterior motive? But if you cannot handle criticism, you cannot handle dissent, you cannot take the weight of people's thoughts and minds, then maybe being government is not what you're meant to do. Do something else. Which means I'm saying that government duty and responsibility weighs heavily on them to protect these rights. And journalists play such an important role to check on government. So the using of these laws, and these laws are overdue for reform. I think under Pakatan Harapan, I think the Bar Council, SUHAKAM, many groups were actively proposing reform language, amendment language, repeal language. That energy just dissipated and it's gone silent. And for me, that is worrying. I think it's not only worrying for journalists, but it's worrying for our society. So I think that's where we are. I mean, we're focusing on the Anti-Fake News Act, but that longer list is even more worrying than that Anti-Fake News Act. Thanks.
Thanks, Jerald. That kind of thing. I remember you just now you were saying that Pakatan Harapan came in with such a high energy, high expectation, and then what actually happened? Why there's a downward trend of that energy, or to a point where we also question what happened to the political will to actually carry out all these reforms, and of course, one of the questions is it that hard to actually put these reforms in place? Sinu, what do you think?
Why the energy? Well, it's to make it fun. It's a bit like a relationship, isn't it? You you get in the relationship with somebody. They made you certain promises. They don't deliver on those promises. You get disappointed. You get jilted. You don't know whether to trust again. So
it's like getting married right after meeting someone you really like, getting married, then you realize, oh no, this person.
Yeah, you realize that it's not working out. So what do you do about that? And I think that's what happened really. In a nutshell, people just got tired of listening to promises that have been consistently broken. So I think everyone decided to just take the view that every politicians are the same and politics is not the way to bring about change, which to a certain extent that's true. And that's why we see probably a surrender of this political space, which I think is very dangerous to not the best people. And that's the sort of explains why the drop in energy that we are suddenly facing, and a drop of interest, and just this general widespread skepticism, amongst the political scene in Malaysia.
But it's also a disenfranchisement of the democratic space itself, right?
That comes along with it. Because we are ceding this political space to those who are in power now, and we are not participating. The best people are not in there. That's why whoever that's in power now, they get to do whatever that they want. I think if we, really desire to bring about change, we need to get back into that space. We need to take back control. And to take back control, it's really a combination of factors. You need to have your human rights respected. You need to ensure that freedom of speech and expression is upheld, even when it's not. We need to constantly knock on the door. We need to continue shouting until somebody hears us. What is dangerous is for us to keep quiet, for us to regress, for us to just accept whatever that's happening to us, and say that this is okay. Because if being silenced is the new normal, then we are down a very, very slippery slope.
And, we have seen Malaysia going through the ranks, being ranked among the best in Southeast Asia when it comes to World Press Freedom Index. Again, these are indexes again. But we also seen some instances where journalists are also not united, taking down among their own peers, that sort of passive-aggressive behavior of allowing those in power in using some of these laws to take on journalists. What do you say about that?
I think it's a very, in this, I'm not sure whether this was like this 20 years ago, but what we see happening now is that there's a lot of counter narrative, that one right is greater than another right. When human rights is really meant to be universal, it's meant to be indivisible. You cannot alienate one right and say that, okay, this takes precedence. So what we are seeing here is that you have freedom of speech being curbed by, or purportedly being curbed wrongly by other types of freedoms. For example, freedom of religion. That is, I think, not something that is unique to Malaysia, but it's unique worldwide, where you cannot fairly comment, or you're not allowed to say anything that would otherwise be deemed as offensive by practitioners of the religion. So that's something that we need to address, and I think that's something that media practitioners, and not just media practitioners, it's not fair to single them out. Lawyers, jurists, society in general, they need to realize that you can't curb freedom of speech simply because you might get offended, and we need a realignment of what is actually right, because in this day and age where everyone's opinion can so easily be heard on so many different platforms, we seem to think that every single opinion out there weighs equally. Every single opinion out there is right. No, it's not. Not every single opinion is right. There are opinions which are consistent with international human rights norms, international human rights principles, and those are the opinions that we need to amplify. Those are the opinions that we need defenders, human rights defenders, to come out and say that, look, this is the correct opinion. We cannot, like what I mentioned earlier, we cannot give up this space to those who threaten to silence us on the name of race, religion, or other factors.
Thanks, you. I think we will. I would like to bring to the next part. When I saw this title talking about rights of media in Malaysia. Like myself, I have not experienced being called by authorities. Thank God, touch wood, I won't be called by any authorities yet. Although the minister whom I worked with before is right now is a communications minister. So we've seen quite a number of young journalists coming in, and then they do get surprised, getting called for statements, receiving subpoena, and even investigated by authorities for their work, for reporting. Like many of us, we are unaware of our rights out there with the current legal framework. what can we do? What rights do we have if we're being called in by the police or to give to provide witness statement?
Well, legal literacy is, of course, something that's very important. I think to a certain extent, we lawyers, we contribute to the legal confusion that is out there. We don't seem to make the law simple for everyone to consume, and that probably led to a lot of lack of awareness amongst everyone, not just media practitioners. So what rights do you have when you are being called, when you're being questioned? Well, the most important right that you have is that you have a right to consult a lawyer. You have a right to be accompanied by a lawyer to the police station. That's something that the police they cannot deny, and to be fair to them, they don't normally deny. In the cases that I've been involved in, they have never said that no, you can't follow the journalist in. He or she is by herself. So credit where it's due. And the second thing that you need to know is that you have the right to remain silent. If you do decide to answer, you must answer truthfully, but you can refuse to answer if that may incriminate you. And often in cases where a journalist is being investigated for his or her opinion or his or her piece of writing, it's normally a form of harassment because of the topic that particular journalist touched on. And what we normally tell the journalists is that, look, if they are not being upfront about what exactly you're being investigated and what exactly is the crime that they are accusing you of committing, you should just remain silent, refuse to answer the questions, because it's normally a rabbit hole. When you start answering one question, they would start probing into your thoughts, and having certain thoughts, that's not a criminal offense. It's what you write. They don't question you. They may question you on your writing, and your writing may not disclose any particular criminal offense. But in my experience, the questioning doesn't stop at your writing. The questioning, it will go into what you believe and whether you're aligned politically to a party or otherwise. So you could start to see that it is not a investigation that is being done in good faith. It's being done purely to harass. And if that's the case, why participate in it? Just refuse to answer because it's so vague, it might incriminate you, and just answer in court if they do decide to bring you to court. But most of the time, 9 cases out of 10, it doesn't end up in court. You are just being asked to being asked to go to the police station for questioning, and it normally ends there. They are definitely going to take your laptop or your handphone, but that's about it. So the Garam, I think Garam and ICJ, was it ICJ?
CIJ.
CIJ. I think they're about to publish a handbook for media practitioners to advise them on their rights, not just on the police investigation part, but also on defamation and also on how they address their editors or their company. So that's something to look forward to. But I'll stop there.
Senior, just on another question. Just in the case that, let's say we have the right to remain silent, and let's say the police come to you and say, oh, we can also charge you for obstructing our work, obstructing a public officer. Can they do so like that
by presumably not by remaining silent, right? By recording, I would think. Yeah, that happened recently.
That happened to a student.
It happened to a student.
And I remember people were linking that to what happened in the US of recording what the police officers are doing as part of the documentation.
Yeah. So that is perfectly legitimate. There is nothing in the law which prevents you from documenting what the police is doing in the course of investigations, unless it's something that is extremely sensitive where it would compromise the investigation. For example, murder, kidnapping, sexual offenses, where the disclosure of it would jeopardize the entire investigation, then perhaps they have a case. But most of the time, that's not the investigation. And I think journalists and people are quite sensible, when it comes to documenting. If you know it's a murder investigation or it's a kidnapping case, you're not going to record or document what's going on. But when it's a case where they're investigating you for sedition, they're raiding your house for publishing something, criminal defamation, for example, that it's perfectly legitimate because the law doesn't say that you cannot do that. But of course, it goes back to what I said a few questions ago. They might decide to invoke certain laws against you, rightly or wrongly, more often the time wrongly, just to put you through the trouble of having to deal with it.
It's kind of reminded me of one of the case by Indra Kayangan assemblyman, where he was being charged in the court for obstructing a police officer. Where he tendered a video incident as an evidence, and then later he was acquitted. But unfortunately, we don't have body cams currently, not yet in place. So that will be a difficult part. Of course, with our phones and everything, that's the best way for us to record. Even if we are at a scene as a reporter, the best thing is we have to start recording as an evidence. So to you, Jerald, in your observation and also SUHAKAM's observation, with some of these challenges faced by journalists, what are your thoughts and what should be done?
I think specifically the harassment, if journalists look at themselves as a human rights defender, then it will take on a different position. Of course, then the legal literacy is needed. They would need to know what to say, what not to say, and defend what they wrote, because they're doing their job and their duty. And I think for us, calling on the authorities to desist from even investigating, because Malaysia, there's a fashion, if there's a police report and then you'll be called in, and then if 100 people line up and make a police report, then it looks like it's more weighted. I mean, it can't be a number game. So the police must have their own threshold to decide, okay, this is, it's obviously a politically motivated case, and this is a journalist, so journalists, we give a bigger leeway, because police can still investigate their work even without the need to bring them in and to investigate them. So I think that's the first part about journalists themselves being empowered. It's a tough job. It's a job that is sometimes merciless, and you get pulled in all directions. And I think I saw a comment on the chat box also. The best of journalists is only as good as what the editor decides to allow or not allow. So we only know the frontline journalists, and we will whack them and kuto them, but actually somebody else will put your story in or not, or give it a twist. And so I think overall the organization must also stand up to some principles of truth reporting. And I think we have not discussed about this framework in Malaysia of actually a successful government needs people to have information. And that right of people for information is really not discussed, debated, or demanded. I mean, except of course with some people when we feel it, the human rights NGOs, Bar Council, SUHAKAM, and so this is. But the common person actually must shout out that they need the info. And in today's world, without information, how are we even going to buy a proper handphone? Or without information, how are you going to know whether we can trust that new product in the market. So I think the position of human rights, both globally, internationally, is that right of freedom of opinion and expression is not just a shouting out. It's not just, hey, I want to say something. It's actually to also respect the freedom of others to hold opinions without interference, or to seek and receive and impart information. This is an international standard in the United Nations, and codified in so many other ways in our own constitution or laws. But I think this is where our defense is. If a government needs to function, it must then take on the role to want to tell its citizen that you need to know your rights, because if they know their rights, they will access public service, and if they access public service, they're happy with the government, then the government gets marks, either brownie points or real points, but without them, the gap is people will be getting angry with government for inability for public service, but government has not engaged media as a partner, but not as a propaganda partner, but as a free-flowing agent who can critically put it out and also say what they think in order to improve.
So, Jerald, do you see now that the government, whether it can be the past government or the current government, do you see how they engage the media as just a propaganda tool or being used by anyone in power?
So I think now it seems the kinds of questions, everybody's hiding under the COVID framework. Like you cannot have too many people, and questions seem to be very few. It's not that, I remember in the past media conferences when Mahathir was PM round 2, everybody was taking up their hand and shouting out questions, including you, Norman. You used to be one of those shouting questions there. But now I don't see that. I think it's all like neat questions, respectful question, and not provocative, and I think that is doing a disservice to the public, because as a fourth estate defenders, you will need to query, but media practitioners, journalists would know what the space they're allowed to ask the question, and if they don't get that space, then it's back on the government's responsibility. So I would think I don't see that dynamism anymore, but I'm also qualifying it. The COVID press conferences are very, very limited, but I would really like to see that kind of tough, inquiring questions that sharpens even politicians to answer them. We've lost that, losing that space much more, and very few ministers actually speak to journalists these days. I don't see much reporting, just more short tweets. So I think it's duty of government to be accountability, and your partner will have to be the journalists, the media practitioners, because they're going to get that message to us. But while you're happy when they give good marks to you, you must also be prepared when they report what they think we have not done, where there are gaps or where we have failed. It's a full package. You cannot just have one part of the media and journalists, then you will compromise them. So I think that culture of journalists being loud and vocal, like what I remember in the previous government, now I don't seem to sense that much. And I hope journalists, you need to keep continuing your role as a defender of information, human rights defender, I will call it, but you don't have to call it human rights defender. But government, I think you need to open up the space and allow more journalists in, and allow all kinds of media. Don't pick and choose a certain type of media. We cannot go back to what we were before in the darker times. We've passed that a long time ago. And controlling media for me is a waste of energy and time, because the information will still get to us anyway. So I don't know why they even try to do that.
Thanks, Jerald. What do you think's in you? You've seen some of the cases that we've been reporting, and then do you think what do you think about Jerald's view about saying now journalists are becoming more hesitant in their reporting these days, not just because of COVID-19. There's a change of government and also, regressing. Do you think that we are regressing back to the old days just to avoid and keep yourself afloat?
Oh, what Jerald said got me thinking about the role of journalists. Because of technology, you got Twitter, Facebook, and everything. You can quite easily disseminate information to whoever, and the whole role of a journalist and the whole idea of journalism seems to have been, I don't know how to put it, blurred because of the direct access everyone has to technology. So you don't need an intermediary anymore, and that seems to be quite, I don't know how to, I think it's good, but I think it's also dangerous, because if there's so many information out there, you don't know whether this source is trustworthy or this source is credible.
Yeah,
But-
and everyone
but-
is rushing to be
Yeah.
the first one to post, like, oh, this statement I must post first, but you don't know whether the statement is true, right?
Yeah.
That kind of thing. So it also blurs the line of where the usual ways of how journalists would do is that, okay, I'm going to call on my editor whether this one is good to go or not.
Yeah.
Now it's the journalists there themselves becomes the news broadcasters themselves.
Needs to be instant, and if you look at this COVID situation, rightly raised by Jerald, KKM, Kementerian Kesihatan Malaysia, the health ministry, every day they publish the statistics, and last time you would think that would come from the newspapers, but now we don't even have to go through the newspapers. We don't have to go through the media. We can get it direct, and maybe that's one reason why journalism in this day and age, I think it's becoming tougher, and the role is becoming diminished. So, but I think that yes, you could see that there is less difficult questions being posed now. I'm not sure what the reason for that is, but that is something worrying, because at least with technology, you could block whoever you don't want to hear. But if you have a journalist asking the tough questions, just in person to the minister or to whichever government officers, that's harder to avoid. And we there are some things where we can't just put everything online. There's some things where you need to do it the old-fashioned way. You ask them a tough question, shout back at them. That's how it should be. So yeah.
I remember back then we used to shout, say like, what do you say about the 2 million ringgit in your account? And then the person will just look at you. Now I think you can relate which particular person, but that person is not a politician. It's a politician's wife lah. A friend of mine was being targeted for asking that question. And then back then, ministers also used to nitpick and target, just because you are from a certain organization, being a critical press, you've been, humiliated publicly, just like that. We've seen that before. And also, I remember like what Jerald and yourself have mentioned about journalists asking questions, asking difficult questions. I think as journalists, we need to bear in mind that it is very important for us that we are not writing for our organization only. We are not reporting just because we are journalists, because we are asking questions on behalf of the people who wants to know the current situation, because it's of a public interest. Now, Kishin is back with us. Like he said, he shared earlier, he was a court reporter. So, over this year, how do you look at it in terms of how difficult it is these days as a journalist in facing so much restriction in reporting, and even to a point where, because you need to kowtow to certain authorities or even toe the line, and you're unable to report what you have to report?
Thanks for the question, Norman. I think there's two levels to it. You need like a strong organization backing you. Sometimes reporters feel the need to self-censor. It's mostly because they don't have their editors out, keeping their back. But I think when you have that trust within your organization, you can take that first step of confidence, because even if someone does take you to court, you know that you have your organization backing you, and some larger companies even have in-company lawyers. And failing which, the union has, if you are a union member, it does have a purpose where, I mean, a function and a fund to back its members who need to go to court and maybe their company cannot back them. So when you at least have that sense of safety behind you, that's one thing. But even then, I think maybe people don't realize that they have this safety net, so they might not be willing to put themselves out there. And then again, like some people, well, journalism is a career, right? Some people feel like it's not worth poking the hornet's nest and then screwing yourself over like long term. So it's a balance between, is it your ethics that you have to do the right thing every time, and versus for some people it's just a job, right? Like at what point do you draw the line? My job versus my professionalism. So yeah, I think in the last year it's also been really confusing, right? Because the political situation has been so flip-flop. So when you're trying to refine your ground about like whose loyalties are to whom, I think there's a lot more chance to step on the wrong toes again, or not realize who's now friends with who you didn't expect to be.
Isn't it better that you don't know who are your friends and foes, but you have to stay neutral then, because you cannot take any sides at the end of the day?
Oh, I kind of mean like the people you're reporting on, you might not realize that like you ask source A then source B, then don't realize they're in cahoots with each other. So that could lead to a kind of an awkward situation like, oh, okay, you're friends now. Oops. Yeah, but yeah, good point. For reporters themselves, at least, if you're not playing sides, then you shouldn't really care which side the politicians are on. But yeah, you got to be aware of which sides they are on the background, so you don't like, I guess, show your cards to the wrong people as well. There's a consideration there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's we don't have that. I remember we during my classes when I during my classes I had was we've been shown to have like, oh, which are the media have media biases over the left, center, all right. We don't have that. How are we going to measure where media actually stand? And who owns the media? I think this will be a whole total different topic itself. I think, in my opinion, I do think that the public have the right to know whether this media is owned by a certain political party, is leaning towards certain individuals or not. A public has the right to know. And I remember when I was in the US observing the midterms election, you can see very clearly that they made editorial that we support this particular candidate. You know where they stand, and you know where they're gonna, what way they write the reports. But one of the things that I want to move on next to is, in this midst of a COVID-19 pandemic, right? What does NUJ as well as IOJ look at the protection of journalists in a line of duty, because they've been exposed. And then even I currently, when I previously covered the Sabah elections, it's very risky because we get scolded by the public for having the media scrum all over again. But do we have proper protection in terms of our health? Risk. This is actually a health risk for journalists. Do we have our rights on that? Kishin, you had to turn on your unmute.
Yeah. If the topic is on welfare of journalists, I think NUJ is the more appropriate body to address this. And I think in the early days of COVID, there were outreaches by organizations to the NUJ to at the very least like hand out masks and sanitizers and give advice to the members. But I think more relevantly is like, okay, people all have that already, but you have to realize that the union represents you as a safe place as well. If you feel uncomfortable being pushed out into covering something in public in person, you should speak up to your editors and to your union representative if you feel your editor doesn't have your best interest. Because again, professionalism is his job. You don't want to kill yourself literally to cover something, right? And I think within reason, you don't always need to put yourself at the front line. I mean, like if you're just trying to get a quote from say a politician, a doorstop might not be the best strategy nowadays. I guess you're putting everyone at risk. And organizations need to be more mindful of this as well. If your reporter gets sick, then you putting your organization at risk, and that's just not professional to do that to your staff as well. I think that's kind of my stance on like your safety should come first before work. In terms of IOJ, we provide we are more training centered, and I guess training on safety is not entirely essential because the basics are quite straightforward. And I think there's not much more we can do beyond like play it safe and have open communication with your employers, not to put you at risk. Yeah.
Thanks, Kishan. Talking about COVID-19 pandemic protection and welfare for journalists and social media workers, I think one of the few things where public may not know is that when journalists put their byline, and it is also the sub-editors and editors, news editors, they are responsible for putting up the stories. At the end of the day, right, sometimes headlines go awry. It gets really, really bad, and the author of the story gets targeted by netizens. You see that, for example, in January this year, TV3 broadcast journalist was being threatened online. His story is very simple, about the poor conditions of primary school in the East Coast in Terengganu, highlighting the poor conditions of the primary school, about lack of electricity and water supply. Public interest story, no harm, but he gets death threats by a public. What can we do as journalists? Are we doing enough to protect journalists in this way? What do you think, Sinyu and Jerald? Maybe either one of you can chip in.
Well, I think any death threat is a no-no. I mean, it's not specially for journalists. Anyone who's threatened, that's an alarm bell should go, and that person should immediately file a police report, submit a complaint to the Human Rights Commission, and make sure the journalist union is behind you to take up the issue to defend. I think, Kishan is right. You seem to be speaking about the role of the union, and I think it's very important that your own organization be a strong defender of this. And I think the union should come out more to speak on even the smallest type of harassment on any member of any journalist community in Malaysia. It could be a small online or a big major one, even if you're not a member of the union, because it's the climate and the environment that you need to defend, not per se just membership of the union. I'm not talking about legal counsel to take them to the court. That's different. Huh? That maybe you only have limited resources, but the overall defense. So that is definitely something needed, and we need to get the message out that no way attacking the messenger, shooting the bird, the carrier of the messenger is all right. So I think most newspapers and online portals these days offer that space for the other side to say its piece, and I think that should be common practice. But the problem is we don't have training for the common public on having a discussion, a critical discussion of dissenting views, that it's okay, you can say the worst things about what you think I did wrong, and I should have a way to answer them. And this may be a question to Kishan, your institute, or even the union. Maybe it's time you all not only do training for journalists, but do training for politicians to be prepared for the onslaught by journalists, because you know what you're going to ask and how to, so I think the other side of the coin is that people feel so defensive, and these are normally people in power, both civil service, they don't like to answer questions. And of course, politicians, they are always thinking of a political mileage. But maybe it's time people like you, Kishan, who knows the game, should offer training for politicians in order to be able to stand there, smile, and take up the most toughest of questions. And that changes the culture. We don't have too many people who would stand up and change the culture of discussing with critical questions or critical views. Thanks.
I think there would be a lot of money to be made there.
How not to be too defensive with the press.
Polishing politicians.
But well, sometimes when politicians sometimes the senior public officials get defensive, right? It's recorded on video, and that's a story. Sinu, what do you say, Sinu?
Yeah, I think from a legal perspective, we don't have enough protection for journalists, for media practitioners. There is a certain degree of risk that comes along with journalism, and the most obvious being defamation, But how defamation laws are in Malaysia, and not just defamation really, but if you think about it, media practitioners being harassed, you ask yourself this: what is there in the legal framework, Malaysian legal framework, that's there to prevent this from happening? Of course, one could say that harassment or death threats, for example, it's illegal in Malaysia. Yes, it is, but those are the extreme cases. We largely depend on the authority to make sure that the laws are being properly enforced to prevent such threats from being carried out, or such threats from being condoned. But it's few and far in between, you see. But there's the other cases that are out there, and this is the majority really, where journalists are being harassed either by the authorities themselves or by companies through SLAP, what they call it, strategic litigation against public participation, SLAP suits, defamation suits. What can we do better? I think there's a need for us to relook at the defamation laws that we have. There's a need to look at special provisions being provided for the act of journalism. For example, in the Communications and Multimedia Act, I was thinking, why isn't there any defense related to fair comment or free speech? There isn't. So that's something for us to consider at a policy level. But unfortunately, our discourse of harassment or rights of media practitioners in Malaysia is still at the very, very infantile level. It's very topical. Every time a sensational story is being reported, a journalist is being harassed, everyone jump, but that discourse doesn't seem to mature into policy decisions. So I think it's not just us pointing fingers at those who are in power. We have to ask ourselves, the movement that we are in, the unions that are backing us, what are the next steps for them to address this long term? Otherwise, we're not progressing. We're just fighting fire.
Yeah, I think you're right, Sinyo. We'll be constantly stuck in this loop of, it's happening and over again. This comes to mind of one of the arguments made in one of the court cases between a private company and a news media about neutral reportage, about using neutral reportage. But we don't have that provisions stated very clearly in any of the clauses, in any of the laws. So I think it would be a good way for NUJ and also unions and also all the other media organizations to actually push for a policy change to include some clauses to protect journalists in reporting public interest stories, where it can be, for example, as simple as Sungai Kim Kim environmental disaster going on. So you are also open to libel suits like that. I also want to move to one of the things that was raised by Richard in the chat earlier of one of our colleagues, Kau Gachi. She was attacked online with racist abuse for her story about one of the minister defending logging activities in Kelantan. No, this is not new because Gachi is one of the well-known. We call her big sister. She's how to say, she's not afraid of asking questions. Yeah, she was the one who asked a question to the politician's wife about a 2 million ringgit, and she get a lot of brunt because of that. So we've seen this year itself, not just Gachi, I think a lot more. Even we have one reporter from a foreign correspondent getting, attack online. Even Al Jazeera's case, where the journalists that were threatened, they were doxxed by mob netizens. It can be for pro-government or pro-establishment, it doesn't matter, but they've been doxxed. And they are open to this kind of threats. Personal details are protected under the Personal Details Protection Act, but there were still no actions against those who expose the details publicly just to put the journalist in danger. What do you say about that, Jerald?
I think similar practice. Two things. First of all, your comments will invite people's comments. I think, and you want people to comment on your writing. You don't want silent reading. So I think that's a reality. It's not only for journalists. I think SUHAKAM also, you can go to our webpage and you can see the amount of hate messages and speech when we speak up on human rights, and it's been going on for some time. But the only test here is if a journalist feels threatened, safety, security, or life, that is serious. It's not for us to tell this journalist, take it easy, it's just comments. It's not true. Only the person knows that at that moment, that feeling of threat, and that feeling of threat is real, and that should be reported and protected, as we spoke earlier. So I think this is where I call upon the Minister of Multimedia should be the defender of journalists. He should speak up, and journalists should call on him to. Norman is smiling. Norman is your old boss.
Yeah, my ex-boss. Maybe he should be one of our panelists next.
Yeah. It's a good idea. But I think this is what the defense, it's not the content, but the defense on decorum, on freedom of speech. And these are speech by journalists who actually play a role, a duty to society. So I think that's where I draw the line. But beyond that, if people write comments, and if the journalists there feel, okay, it's no big deal, you just talk whatever you want, I leave it to that journalist. But the moment somebody says, I want to incite violence or attack you or call on you, then I think that kind of monitoring, maybe it's the union, maybe it's Kishin, you would know which institute, journalist institute who monitor this thing, should take it up systematically and even submit complaints to SUHAKAM, and also get the Bar Council to issue positions, statements of protection for this. So I would take it at two ends. But again, my question for this journalist that you mentioned, Kau Gachi, right? Kau Gachi. She, is it she? Gachi. Yeah, she would be the one to be asked if she's feeling threatened. That is real, and that's a human rights violation, and she needs to be protected. Thanks.
Thanks, Jerald. Kishin, Sinu, you want to give in your thoughts about that? Kishin?
I think, yes, the threshold between like mean comments versus actually dangerous threats or doxing. But we have to remember as well that it's not just randos attacking journalists. There's been a trend recently where those in authority have been inciting brigadering against journalists. And that's really like beyond the pale. I think this is part and parcel with the whole fake news thing where you try to discredit journalists. And in that sense, even mean comments can be quite dangerous as well, because it always starts there and you never know where it's going to snowball to. But yeah, it's a good point that I have not considered that, like how we union and IOJ sometimes does cross paths or work together with the Bar Council or such. But yeah, we should actively be reporting to like SUHAKAM, so you can keep tabs on exactly the details of what's going on here. Yeah, good point. Best to have an information network in that sense.
You know, just to offer a slightly different point of view, since we are when we talk about freedom of speech and expression, and the complaint has always been, okay, the authority is trying to curb speech and expression, and then at the same time, we need to look at ourselves and ask, are we contributing to that by trying to silence speeches which are mean or nasty? But of course, threatening speeches, yeah, that's a no-go. But again, that's often a question of threshold, isn't it? How far can you go until it becomes threatening? I think we need to not silence others, whatever comments that may come, simply because it may be unpleasant. Because we can't on one hand say that, okay, I'm all for speech and expression, and at the same time, when there's a differing point of view, nasty as it may sound, we say that, okay, I think this guy needs to be silenced. So that's something for us to think about. And if you were to take this conversation further, and this probably another story for another day, you have the whole cancer culture. That's something that I think I have at a conceptual level, I've difficulties appreciating.
I'd like to add something to that. I think look at it as fair game as well, like how reporters and media organizations have a higher threshold, high responsibility, I guess, because we transmit to so many people, right? And media organizations are assumed to be responsible parties. On one hand, random people or general netizens, yeah, it's up to them to say what they want. They shouldn't be so stifled. But on the flip side, actual authorities or say ministers, they have to be as responsible as media organizations. So that's why I say specifically to them, it's unacceptable when they invoke or call on crowd violence onto journalists. For them, even a mean comment is much more, I guess, qualified in that sense. They have more authority backing that thing, so it's a bit more dangerous. So for them, they need to be much more responsible than the general public.
Yeah, I think Kishan is right about the comments made against journalists, because of the responsibility that you hold. But I'm also asking one step further, the defense of journalists by people in authority. That silence cannot be allowed. There's too much of silence in the present government. It's like, okay, just do and let it happen, let it grow, When there was xenophobia, incitement against the Rohingyas, silence. Journalists get attacked, silence. I mean, of course, it's not the government who said those things, but you are government of the day. You have a duty to make your position clear. The people will not even agree with you. They will probably attack what the minister said on Facebook, but that's your duty and responsibility. And I think we don't have standard bearers here in Malaysia. That void, that gap is growing, and that's why people are taking their own hand, like, it's okay. We can attack, another 10 people will join, and then the word spreads. And and if it's politically sensitive, that's how I think that journalist, she got attacked, because it seemed to group defending that minister. So I am still calling on where is ministerial leadership, which I call government leadership and state leadership, in moments like this when we need protection. This is just one group of people, the journalists. We haven't talked about other segments of society, but just for journalists being such an important interlocutor of information and development for the country, you need loud voices to protect you. And I think that absence is too loud.
Thank you so much, Jerald. So, we'll come to the final part of our session here today, this evening. So let me start with Sinyu. You have I would like you to share your final thoughts about what we have discussed over in this webinar today.
I'll just pick up from what Jerald had said. That you need a loud voice to stand up for you, and the way I see it, this might be quite recent memory, is that even journalists in Malaysia is quite fragmented, and we were looking forward to having the media council. I'm not sure what has happened to that. About a year ago, there was talks, and I think it was quite an advanced talk. There were plans for a media council, so that we were hoping it could sort of like spearhead rights of journalism and in Malaysia, but that somehow, like many other things, it seems to have been set aside. So someone should pursue that again. And I think that's the first step, really, towards a unified, journalist group in Malaysia. Because currently I think there's quite a number of unions out there, quite a number of groups out there, and I'm not sure which is which. So that's something for us to consider. And I think it's also quite important that journalists self-regulate rather than being dependent on the government. So a lot of things like the Printing Presses and Publication Act, the Communications and Multimedia Act, if all that could be sort of unified under a legislation which creates the Media Council for them to self-regulate what content is acceptable, what content is not acceptable, I think that's the way forward. So yeah, I think that's what we need to revisit.
Thank you, Sinyu. What about you, Jerald?
Thanks. I support Sinyu's groping for the answer. What happened to the Human Rights Council? Society cannot be left to grope for answers when something is supposed to be on the table. So the Media Council definitely is needed. Independent, self-regulated, of I think professional journalists, they'll manage themselves. And society will be a benchmark to know if the council works or not. But that is important. I think that will be bringing from all spectrums of journalists together. So I totally think it's long overdue, and we need that infusion. I think my final point is the freedom of expression. As I said earlier, it works both ways. It's a right for one to express that human right. Yet it is that freedom of expression to also seek information, not only impart information, but also seek. And that right to information, I think, is the big gap here. I think there was someone who made a comment earlier about the Official Secrets Act. It's not just an Official Secret Act against journalists. It's actually a Secrets Act against, I mean the word against deliberately, against whole society. This government and all states are duty bound to speak to us as the main investors in our country, and if we don't get that information, then how are we going to continue our lives? So I think this right to information is so sacrosanct, but here it's almost can be washed away with some feeble arguments about the normal one we hear is, yeah, human rights is fine, but there's no absolute freedom of expression. Who doesn't know that? I mean, you and I know, you cannot be absolutely do anything to the hilt when it impacts another person. And I think the Bar Council, lawyers, human rights practitioners are very sharp to define very clearly pronounce limitations only for that prescribed areas. So it's actually blocking out very small areas for exceptions, And the test is government must respond to us, not we start begging them to give us information why this is still under the Secrets Act, And this is why I think the promise of getting out of the OSA framework to Freedom of Information framework, again, like what Senior said, we're waiting for answers on the Media Council. We're again waiting for answers what happened to the move from balancing the secrecy to right to information. But I think this society deserves that long overdue, and it's going to be in the benefit of society. And journalists will need that tool for them to work. And my final point is, government and ministers, it is to your advantage. Freedom of information is going to work. It's not going to be easy. You can say the best things. There'll be one group of people who will not like what you say. I mean, that's the new world. Now, whatever we say, there'll be one group. But that won't stop you from being a person of integrity and standing up to what you believe. But you need somebody to write about it and to carry the message in the best way the journalist thinks to represent you. And if you think by silencing journalists and giving them a chilling framework to operate, you will do a service to the nation, I think it's a disservice. And I think that's old style, long overdue, long gone. And I really pray and hope this present set of new government ministers under PN will live up to the very reason they fought to take over a government. Do something better than the last, I mean, that must be the only reason you became government, to do better. If not, I'm not sure why you became government. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerald. What about you, Kishin? Will you be able to help us, let us speak also to the government in how we can get what's best out of it. So what do you think on your final thoughts?
Okay. Yeah, I think the Media Council is long overdue. And again, it comes down to kind of like with each government change, it kind of gets reset. Because like no government wants to pick up the previous one's plan and be like, oh, okay, like we just finished what the previous guy did. So, but I mean, it's and the concept that's been done in other countries. I think Indonesia has a pretty good example of a media council. So, I mean, it shouldn't be so much about egos and just they should just push forward in it and see how it works. It can always be subject to change afterwards, right? I think the important thing is like it would be quite a game changer once it's in place and people see like a new way of how the media can be more like a united front and also like an interface between government and media. What else? In terms of media safety now, I think the pandemic, apart from health safety, is also tearing through media organizations from a financial perspective. So in the short term, I'm kind of more worried about the media industry's ability to keep sustaining itself. So I think that would be another issue for another day, I guess. Soon there won't, if there's no journalist, there's nothing to protect, I guess. Yeah. Yeah. In that sense, I think journalists need to make the public feel more connected to them as well. So a new model would probably be necessary there. And the connection could also help the public feel more, I mean, right now there's like a cleft, right? It feels like the media is representing some sort of elite group or their own interest or something, and the public doesn't feel connected to them. I think that creates a bit of hostility between the general public or different pockets of the public and media. So yeah, if we are representing the people, we should be speaking to them as well directly. So yeah, I think that we've lost something there a bit. Yeah, I think we need to reconnect on that point.
Kishin, now you sounded like a politician. It's like, getting the journalists to reconnect back to the people is like, I think it's true. Yeah, speaking for the right. Yeah, it is true. Where if we want the public to support and to, especially when media businesses are finding it really, really hard to survive these days, at the end of the day, it's not about asking the public to pay for news. It's more of a public investment in quality and good news so that journalists can report freely for them, because they need the information at the end of the day. So I think that really sums up from you, Kishan, from Jerald, and also Cecin you. And thank you all to our panelists today for your input, your suggestions, and so many recommendations from there, from what we have discussed earlier in our webinar today. So on behalf of the organizers, I would like to thank the Embassy of Switzerland in Malaysia, the European Union, Human Rights Commission of Malaysia, SUHAKAM, International Federation of Journalists, IFJ Asia Pacific, and National Union of Journalists, NUJ Malaysia. So, and please join our group on Facebook and continue our discussions and conversations with My Media Matters. So to our listeners and participants, you can follow our IFJ's Facebook at facebook.com IFJ Asia Pacific, and on Twitter and Instagram at IFJ Asia Pacific. So we'll be sharing this webinar forum on Anchor.fm and Spotify. So you can follow up on the podcast, and let's continue our conversation. And rather than just continue our conversation, let's start our action. Maybe Jerald, we can start something, and that's for a start for 2021. 2020 has been a very disastrous year after all.
Yeah, let's fast forward.
Doing
2 more weeks.
2 more weeks, 2 more weeks, 2 more weeks.
It can't possibly get worse, right?
Vaccines coming in.
Famous last words.
All right, thank you all. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Norman. Thanks, Kishan. Thanks, Jerald.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.